I want to start by giving you a general definition of what the deep state really is. You're going to hear different opinions on this depending on who you talk to, but here's my own assessment. Really, we need to define two key terms, the deep state and the shadow government. When we talk about the deep state, what we're really talking about is a criminal organization. And when we talk about the shadow government, we're talking about those powerful people who operate that deep state criminal organization, okay? The shadow government, which is also called a cryptocracy, it's a group of powerful people who have so much influence over the policies of the United States that they, in essence, constitute their very own secret government, a government that is functioning behind the scenes, out of sight of the business of what our legitimate government is doing. And these powerful people are alluded to by different labels. Some people call them globalists, the New World Order, the Rothschild Mafia, the Illuminati, and so forth. And really, there are very nuanced differences between those different terms. The terms get misused all the time, but some of these people are politicians. Some of them are bankers. Some of these shadow government operatives are bosses of multinational corporations. Some of them are just simply very rich elitists whose wealth gives them an immense amount of influence. So someone like George Soros, for example. Well, these people include men, it includes women, mostly men, but there are some women. They come from all different political parties and ideologies. Some of them are Marxist, some are fascist, some are corporatist, some are Zionist. Some of these people are U.S. citizens and some aren't. Some of the names are well known to the public, but really most of them are not. Many of the names are not well known. But what unites all of these people is that they are all, each and every one of them, evil sociopaths. These are people who have insatiable lust for wealth and for power. And the way that they go about obtaining power and wealth is through the mechanism of what we call the deep state. The deep state is the organization and its various bureaucracies. Think of the deep state almost like a corporation. The various departments of a corporation, they all function together, but each individual department has its own goals. They do their own things. So for example, the marketing department, what they do is going to be different from what the engineering department does, what the sales department does. But while each individual department has its own department goals and they do different things, the fact is that all of their work combines together to accomplish the overall goals of the corporation, right? Well, that is very much how the deep state operates. It's got all these different components that make up the organization. So it has, for example, the U.S. State Department and its vast bureaucracies. You've got the non-governmental roundtables, the think tanks, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. These things that craft the foreign policies for the State Department to implement. Then there's the military-industrial complex, which is basically just the war-for-profit industry. This is what outgoing President Dwight Eisenhower tried to warn us about. Then there are other powerful groups. There are multinational corporations such as oil and energy giants. We have the military and intelligence communities that are definitely the backbone of the deep state. And then, of course, we've got all of the central and Wall Street investment bankers, or the banks themselves, the institutions. Now, all of these various components, they each have their own individual goals. They're all working for what's good for them. But the powerful players that make up the shadow government, they take the heads or the key figures in these various organizations and they secretly work together for mutual gain. They work outside of the law to achieve what they cannot achieve within the law. And that is what makes them criminal organizations. Now, here's how the shadow government operates. Let's say, for example, we use the example of Syria. So let's say that a group of Rothschild-linked corporations and banks, they want to be able to build a pipeline and, some kind of gas pipeline, oil pipeline through Syria. But the Syrian government says no. What happens is that the New World Order policy development group, which is the Council on Foreign Relations, they write up some policies that would benefit that Rothschild network if America were to implement them. And the purpose of these policies is to coerce Syria into relenting. So this could be, for example, something like placing harsh economic sanctions on Syria to cripple them economically and make the cost of resisting the Rothschilds a much heavier toll than if Syria were to just give in to their demands and give them what they want. Let them build that pipeline. So we've got the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. They write the policies, and those policies are then adopted by the U.S. State Department. The CFR is not a government agency, but it is so intertwined that it's almost inseparable. In fact, many, hundreds and hundreds of CFR members are in key positions in the State Department. Almost all of our secretaries of state since the 1900s have been members of the CFR. Most of these policies that the CFR crafts and that the U.S. State Department implements, they don't require congressional approval. So they're operating largely outside of congressional oversight. The State Department is in reality just a tool of the CFR, and the CFR, again, this is what the Rothschild network uses to take their ambitions, the laws they need to change, the policies that need to be implemented so that they can do what they want to do with their oil corporations, their banks, and so forth. The CFR writes those policies, and they're implemented through the State Department, okay? So the State Department is just a deeply, deeply entrenched government bureaucracy. We need to just gut the State Department. Now, regardless of which party controls the White House, what we always see with the State Department is that this bureaucracy stays essentially the same year after year. And these cryptocrats from the shadow government, they use the State Department as a weapon around the world, a weapon that strong arms other nations, other corporations even, on behalf of the Rothschild network. Now, what happens when the target of the New World Order's sanctions implemented by the State Department or other efforts, when these things fail to achieve their desired goal, if their economic manipulation doesn't work, what they do is they turn to using the deep state's enforcement apparatus. And the main component of that is the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is the organization that enforces the New World Order policies that are written by the CFR. So when Syria, for example, would not go along with the softer approach that the State Department uses, the CIA would go in and try to destabilize the country. And you have the ensuing riots, you have terrorism, all of this designed to overthrow the Syrian government so that the shadow government, the people, could gerrymander an obedient and subservient Syrian regime that would permit the New World Order's plans to go forward. We see this all the time. This is exactly what the CIA and the shadow government did in Ukraine. They ran out the democratically elected pro-Russian president of Ukraine and replaced him with a pro-NATO president with deep connections to corrupt Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. It's exactly what they did. People who were loyal to George Soros and others. So if the CIA can't handle a job on its own, though, if they go in and they try, for example, they've done this in Syria. They did the best they could. They created chaos. They created, bloodshed, but it wasn't enough to topple Assad. So if the CIA can't finish the job on its own, a false pretext is created to justify bringing in the next part of the deep state, which is the U.S. military. They come in to finish the job the CIA couldn't do on its own. Now, I'm not saying that regular U.S. soldiers are members of the deep state. Not at all. That's not my point. But there are elements. It is very clear when you look at Afghanistan, when you look at Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, war after war after war. Is this to protect America? Of course not. These are all wars for territory, for oil, and so forth. Okay, this is the U.S. military being used as an apparatus within the deep state's control to go in and do the work that the shadow government wants accomplished. And all of this is done outside of the knowledge of most citizens. And that's partly because the New World Order owns and controls the corporate media, which shapes the public's perception of reality. In a very literal sense, our media operates a vast psychological operation of mind control by telling the public what they need to hear, hiding from the public those things they don't want the public to even know about, limiting, confining, constricting what the public can actually see and hear, so that the opinions formulated in the minds of the public are only, they're going to be limited to the little bit of information that's given. Former President John F. Kennedy, he alluded to this kind of sinister global conspiracy in a speech to the United States press not long before his assassination. Let me read to you part of what he said. Quote, "We are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations." Doesn't that sound very much like what I've been describing to you? Let me read one or two more sentences. He says, "Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned. No rumor is printed. No secret is revealed." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the deep state that is controlled by the shadow government. Now, of course, back in the 1960s, JFK is referring primarily to what was the threat at the time, and that was the communists. But over time, the communists merely changed their clothes. We now know them as the globalists. But whether we call them globalists or communists, the objectives are the same. Now, let me share some research with you that I've been doing on deep state activities related to Syria. First of all, the Obama administration had the State Department. Leader was Hillary Clinton, right? She was the first Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had already said no to the New World Order Network's plans to run a new pipeline through Syrian territory. He said no. The pipeline would operate in competition with Syria's allies, with Russia and Iran, both nations of which rely heavily on their own oil and gas sales. So the answer was no, we're not going to undermine our own allies. Well, after the U.S. State Department failed to get Syria to budge on this issue, the next phase opened up, with the CIA taking the lead. So we've got the United States deep state coordinated with other factions that had their own vested interests in the downfall of Syria. And those factions outside of the United States included the Israelis. They've got their own geopolitical agenda. You've got the Saudis with their oil competition, so they've got an agenda. You've got the Qataris and others. So the CIA helped to orchestrate an uprising in Syria, and they were arming all of these dissidents. They were providing them with combat training. They were giving them logistical support. And then we've got the Saudis and the Qataris who also began sending weapons to these terrorists. And indeed, these groups were terrorists that the United States was supporting, because it included groups like al-Nusra, which was just Al-Qaeda by a different name, bloodthirsty beasts. Well, Hillary Clinton, as head of the U.S. State Department and as a member of the shadow government, she had helped to orchestrate previously the overthrow of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, right? They armed mercenaries there in Libya and overthrew the government, turned it into an absolute hellhole there in Libya. With Gaddafi dead, those mercenaries that were used to topple him, they traveled up to Iraq and to Syria to continue working. They merged with these existing groups that were already up there. They merged with Al-Qaeda. And when these groups merged, a new terror group was emerged from all this. It was called ISIS. It's also known by the name ISIL, but a lot of people refer to them in general as Daesh. Well, Hillary Clinton eventually resigned as head of the State Department because she had ambitions to run for the presidency, had to get ready for that. And John Kerry, who had run against George W. Bush back in 2004 for president, John Kerry became the new Secretary of State. He picked up the New World Order's baton. The legitimate government that you and I saw, if you watch CNN or MSNBC or even C-SPAN, whatever, what we saw from the government, they were telling us in public statements, one after another, that the United States was not arming these fighters, the United States was not interfering, but all along, that is exactly what the shadow government and the deep state was doing. The shadow government was fomenting a major proxy war against the Syrian government that the American people didn't know about. They didn't know about it because the American people wouldn't have supported it. I did my best back then, back in 2012, 2013, to report on this, to report on what was really going on. But, of course, my voice is severely limited. The reach in comparison to the reach of the deep state's propaganda outlets in the mainstream media. But I did talk a lot about this back then, about specific rebel groups. I put them in there by name, talked about who was arming them, who was funding them. All of this being done with the total knowledge of the U.S. government, of the State Department. And apparently I wasn't supposed to be talking about some of that stuff because it got me in trouble with YouTube at the time. But the fact is, the Obama administration was knowingly lying to the American people. The shadow government was using the various components of this deep state to conduct a secret proxy war that very few Americans knew about at the time. We know about it now, but not back then. Publicly, Secretary of State John Kerry was talking about diplomacy. He was saying that he was working very, very hard with all the various parties to bring about a peaceful diplomatic solution to the Syrian crisis. In fact, I'll play a clip here. On September 9th, 2013, he said that he and Barack Obama fully agreed that the solution to the problems in Syria was strictly political, that there was no military solution to this, that the problems couldn't be resolved on the battlefield. Take a listen to this.
So let me be clear. The United States of America, President Obama, myself, others, are in full agreement that the end of the conflict in Syria requires a political solution. There is no military solution, and we have no illusions about that. A resolution will not be found on the battlefield, but at that negotiating table, but we have to get to that table.
But in secret, John Kerry was quite a different story. He was pushing very hard as he could, not just to arm these proxies, but to have a full-scale war using U.S. ground troops as an invasion force to topple the Syrian government. That is what John Kerry was pushing for. You see, this is how the deep state operates. There is what the government tells us publicly, what most people in America and around the world hear from our government, what they think we're doing. And then there is what the shadow government is doing in secret, without the approval, without the knowledge of the American people, and largely without the approval or knowledge of the U.S. Congress. Now, Kerry said that in September 2013. In that same month, he had a secret meeting at the United Nations with a group of Syrian dissidents. And this included representatives of the White Helmets, notorious group there in Syria, affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The meeting was supposed to be strictly off the record. Kerry thought he just had a bunch of allies in there with him, but somebody in that room secretly recorded the conversation and they leaked it. So let me tell you what you're going to hear, because the audio is not super good. You're going to have to listen close. So let me tell you what to listen for. We've got John Kerry whining about how the American people don't want another war, and that has made it very hard for him because he's been working behind the scenes to start a U.S. ground invasion in Syria that the American people wouldn't go for. He whines about how the U.S. Congress was also unwilling to go along with a war against the Syrian government. And so, Kerry talks about how the United States and its Gulf state allies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, how they had been pouring massive amounts of weapons into the waiting hands of opposition forces, including al-Nusra, which, like I said, is a branch of Al-Qaeda. He says that these opposition forces managed to team up with ISIS, which is also known, like I said, as ISIL or Daesh. That's what he calls it in this clip. He says that he and his allies watched the strength of ISIS grow, which of course was a result of this assistance. We're arming the rebels, arming these groups, these opposition groups, who then ally with ISIS and are transferring all of these weapons into the hands of ISIS. So maybe we're not giving the weapons directly to ISIS, but we're giving them to the people that are turning around and handing it to ISIS. Well, in this video, in this audio, Kerry acknowledges that they know this is going on. He says that they were watching the growth of ISIS. They were watching it with the hope that ISIS would be able to either overthrow Assad or beat him so bad that he would have to essentially relent and give in to the demands of the West, which would be essentially to step down. And because ISIS was becoming so powerful, Kerry says that's why Russia came in. They came in to keep ISIS from toppling the Assad regime. And now that's also why, and he alludes to this as well, that's why Hezbollah from Lebanon came in. That's why Iran came in to help prop up the Syrian government at their request. And he says, he tells this group that Hezbollah is not a threat to America, that they're not attacking America. He says that Hezbollah is normally an enemy of Israel, but that Hezbollah was not trying to fight Israel. And regardless of these facts, regardless that Hezbollah was not attacking Israel, not attacking America, Kerry said we are still arming these proxies inside Syria to kill Hezbollah and Iranian fighters who were battling to defeat ISIS. This leaked audio was incredible, but the mainstream media barely mentioned it. Just like John F. Kennedy said, doesn't get reported, it gets suppressed. It largely went unnoticed by the public at the time. So listen to this clip.
It's pretty difficult right now to get Americans to say we're going to send Americans to invade another country and have a war with Sunni and Shia and extremists and everybody. I mean, it's more complicated than you think. I've argued for use of force. I stood up, I'm the guy who stood up and announced we're going to attack Assad because of the weapons. And then, things evolved into a different process. But the bottom line is that the Congress refused even to vote to allow that. Congress will not authorize our use of force. Congress will not pass that. And so we're trying to help the best way we can. We can always throw a lot of weapons in.
The armed groups in Syria get a lot of support, not just from the United States, but from other partners. And we've never said that
Qatar, Russia, Qatar, Turkey,
Saudi
Arabia, huge amount of weapons coming in, huge amount of money.
But pumping weapons in causes someone else to pump more weapons in.
Hezbollah is exclusively focused on Israel, whom they're not attacking now, and on Syria, where they are attacking in support of Assad.
How to make the Syrian people accept this argument that because Hezbollah or Fadl Abbas, the Iraqi and Iranian groups are not fighting the United States now, so they are not targeted by the attacks against terrorism in Syria. They kill Syrians.
They are targeted by the opposition. We are arming. And training. I mean, the reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him. So Nusra makes it hard. Al-Nusra and Daesh both make it hard because you have this extreme element out there. And unfortunately, some of the opposition has already kind of chosen to work with them.
Now, here we are in 2018. This information may not seem all that shocking to us. At least not to you guys, my viewing audience that is keyed into this kind of information. But at the time, remember, at the time, John Kerry was denying all this. He was talking about how he was engaged in diplomacy, how he knew that fighting wasn't the answer. So this, my dear viewers, is the deep state. This is how it operates. And just as Secretaries of State Clinton and Kerry were part of the deep state running the Obama administration back then, it is a cold hard fact that Trump supporters don't like that CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who Trump now has as Secretary of State, he is also very much a part of this deep state network that is doing terrible things on behalf of the New World Order syndicate that the American people don't know about. How much does the average American know about what is being done in Yemen, in Sudan, in Somalia? Don't know much about that, do you? That we can have a left-wing social liberal like Obama, followed by an alleged right-winger like Trump. Two different administrations, and yet the foreign policies go unchanged. Those same wars continue and even increase. That is evidence that demonstrates we are not in control. We, the people, are not in control. There is a shadow government that is functioning behind the scenes that we and our representatives seemingly have no control over.